First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that this space stands on the country of the Indigenous people who were here for tens of thousands of years before us. And here on the Adelaide Plains, they're known as the Kaurna people. So, this is the very handsome Port Adelaide Institute building. I'm going to talk a little bit about institutes, and then I'm going to look at a number of books that were found as our staff and volunteers worked through the sorting and cataloguing of thousands of old books which had come to us from the closure of the old institute libraries, subscription libraries across the state. And they made some very unanticipated discoveries. They were an unusual find because of their focus on homosexuality. Today, I'm going to look at a number of these books, mostly published between the late 1940s to 1960s. I'm also going to talk a little bit about censorship and Adelaide's early gay and lesbian communities, which may give you an idea of why these particular books were not expected to be on public institute library shelves in the mid-20th century. So, as I said, they were subscription-based lending services. They were in towns and country towns and suburbs right across South Australia. And the institutes were community hubs, especially in the country. Mostly, they were built in the mid to late 19th century, some like this in the early 20th century. This one is at Aldgate. They range from the elaborate to the very simple. This one, by the way, that one was built in 1937. The new building at Aldgate was planned as a large development, but the Great Depression got in the way. And in fact, from the 1920s, the town's Institute Library had operated from the local post office. This one's probably a little more typical, 1933 at Lobethal. You could go to hear a public talk or attend an entertainment or a celebration. You could join a class or a local community group. And of course, you could read a newspaper, a magazine, or borrow a book. Institute libraries were, in fact, the subscription-based forerunners of our wonderful free access public libraries. And there's the Salisbury Institute in 1900, very different from the Salisbury Public Library now. And this one is where we are today, the South Australian Institute in 1867, 6 years after its opening. As well as the Circulating Library, which many of you would have passed as you came in, it also housed the museum and the art gallery. As the institutes were replaced by larger public libraries funded by local councils working with state government, new books and magazines were purchased on a much larger scale, and much of the old published stock came to State Library for storage. Some of it lines the shelves of the Mortlock Chamber and, again, the old Circulating Library in this building. Our ongoing project is to sort and catalogue these old books as far as we can. At various times, they would have been purchased by local and Adelaide-based librarians, acting on book reviews, publishers' information, their own reading and preferences, and readers' requests. So, this fine upstanding gentleman is Thomas Walter White. Any of you heard of him? Nope. He was a war hero, actually, an aviation war hero from World War I. But he's here today because he was the Federal Department of Trade and Customs Commonwealth Minister. He was in charge of Trade and Customs. And they, in turn, were responsible for imports and for censorship, including, and particularly, books. So in 1935, Minister White stood up in federal Parliament and told Parliament that the list of censored books in Australia was freely available to the general public, except it wasn't. Even booksellers and publishers had difficulties accessing the lists. So this was, you could get hold of it if you were within the department, but it wasn't open for general public viewing. And overall, from probably about the first decade of the 20th century through to the 60s, we think around 1,500 publications were banned at different times and for varying periods and for different reasons in Australia in the first about 60, 70 years of the century. So here are just a few examples. State Library holds a number of versions of Boccaccio's Decameron. It was banned in Australia from 1927 to 1936, and then they took it off the list, and then 2 years later they put it on again, and it was banned from 1938 to 1973. This is another one that we hold in our collections. These are the General Library catalogue collections, not the Institute collections. This is Droll Stories by Honoré de Balzac, and the library holds several 19th century editions of this work. It was banned for obscenity from 1901 to 23. Then they decided it was okay, and then the government banned it again from 1928 to 1973. Ours is not to reason why. There were a couple of boards, actually, one larger and one smaller, that were responsible for the censorship, but I don't have time to go into it now. Okay, so here are a few more books that were banned in Australia. Most of you, or many of you, would have heard of them. Forever Amber, Peyton Place, and Norman Lindsay, Australian author, The Cautious Amorist. These weren't located in the State Library catalogue, but I'm pretty sure they would be in the thousands of items not yet sorted from the Institute libraries. And that's because I'm quite sure that a close relative of mine borrowed Forever Amber and Peyton Place from the local Institute library, although this would have been several years after the ban was lifted in Australia. Okay, so if you ask Australians if they know of any book that was banned, and most will answer Lady Chatterley's Lover, version 1, partly because of its overt sex, adultery and explicit language. The fact that D.H. Lawrence dared to cross the sacrosanct British class barrier may also have been a contributing factor. After all, Constance was Lady of the Manor and he was just the gamekeeper. And this one. State Library holds 19 items by African-American writer James Baldwin, and in particular, his novel Another Country was banned in Australia by the Commonwealth Customs Department in February 1963 until May 1966. The Literature Censorship Board described it, and I quote, as continually smeared with indecent, offensive and dirty epithets and allusions, end quote. It did, however, recommend that the book still be made available to the, and I quote, the serious-minded student or reader, end quote. And that may be why the library holds this 1963 edition. Okay, so this is obviously Queen Victoria. Why is she here? Because there is an abiding apocryphal story that lesbians had an easier time being themselves than males did, because sex between consenting adult women was never signed into law as an offence. This, says the apocryphal story, is because the Queen said, "Women do not do such things," and refused to sign it into law. It's a great story, but unfortunately it's not true. Had she refused to sign the relevant legislation, that was the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, Her Majesty would have had to have rejected the entire bill. That would have meant blocking legislation already passed by Parliament and causing a major constitutional crisis. More to the point, well before it reached the Queen, the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 hadn't mentioned homosexual activity at all. Then, while still in Parliament, an MP named Henry Labouchere, it would be a French name, wouldn't it, in the English Parliament? But anyway, probably Norman. Anyway, moved an amendment which was passed. And that amendment allowed the law to punish, and I quote, gross indecency between two men with a prison sentence of up to a year with or without hard labour. And believe me, in 1885, hard labour was genuine hard labour. Lesbians, in fact, were not even mentioned, and that's why they weren't prosecuted to the same extent of the law. It wasn't anything to do with Queen Victoria, or not really to do with Queen Victoria. It was to do with an amendment in the British Parliament. So and in fact, they could still fine women on charges of gross indecency. So you weren't exempt. This particular article is from a South Australian paper, and I'm sorry I didn't note it, but it was essentially about a young woman who was dressing as a male. She went deliberately to somewhere to pick up another female, which she did, and they were then caught on the banks of the Torrens, involved in acts of gross indecency. So, yes, you could prosecute women, but fortunately not to quite the same extent. And, yes, anyway, I'll talk more about that as we go on. I did quote it. 1954, News Adelaide, 29th of September. Okay, it would be the News, wouldn't it? All right. Sorry, did I say that? Okay. So this is, on the left, the price of salt, another item found in the Institute holdings. Claire Morgan was the pseudonym of crime fiction writer Patricia Highsmith. This cover is a first edition 1952 cover, and it was published in 1952 under a pseudonym, Claire Morgan. The novel was described as the first gay book with a happy ending. It's basically a love story about, look, it's going to get sadder, so laugh while you may. It's a love story about Teresa, who was 19, and Carol, who was a very high status, much higher status married woman. And they had a happy ending, which I think is great. I like happy endings. Okay, so lesbian pulp fiction, we're going to talk about that for a little while. Lesbian pulp fiction is a genre of lesbian literature that refers to usually to any mid-20th century paperback novel or pulp magazine with overtly lesbian themes and content. Was first published in the 1950s as a genre, and because very little other literature was available for and about lesbians at this time, quite often these books were the only reference that the public, lesbian and otherwise, had for modelling what lesbians were and what they did. Authors of lesbian paperbacks were, interestingly, both male as well as female, and they often used pseudonyms. The male authors frequently used female names. The one we're looking at here is, now let me think, yes, this is the Artemis Smith, or later Artemis Smith, as you'll see from the one on the right. Basically, she just took the space out between her name and became Artemis Smith instead of Artemis Smith. Or one word. So she was a contemporary of Andy Warhol. She was a poet, playwright, futurist, digital media artist, and as well ran a successful off-Broadway workshop which trained a lot of film and television celebrities of the era. And I'm not sure whether she's still alive. She was certainly alive about 10 years ago. I don't know if she's still going. I couldn't find anything. So if anyone can enlighten me on Artemis Smith, I'd be happy to talk to afterwards. Okay. This one tells the story of women in war, or rather women at war, all cohabiting in a French military barracks. The back cover tells us that the stories were based on real events, as told to the author, Teresa Torres, who died in 2012. Born in 1923, she was French-Jewish, became a writer. She had quite an eventful life. She escaped Nazi-occupied France in 1940 and became a secretary to Charles de Gaulle, Free French leader, in London when she escaped. from that time onwards, she started to write. She wrote around 20 books, novels and memoirs, and mostly lesbian pulp fiction, because into the 50s and 60s it was coming into that, what is called the golden age of lesbian pulp fiction. These were translated from the French and sold very well. She later married the American writer Maya Levin during the war, and he translated many of her novels. And she continued to live and write in France until her death at the great age of age 92. So there's hope for me yet, I think. Okay. Now, Valerie Taylor, A Stranger on Lesbos. And Girls in 3B on the right there. So Stranger on Lesbos is one of the ones we hold in our collection, in the Institute collection. Girls in 3B haven't found yet. I don't know whether we hold it or not, but it's a classic work of lesbian pulp fiction, published by Fawcett first in 1959 by Valerie Taylor. Again, happy ending for a lesbian character was unusual for the time period. It was one of the first 3 novels of any pulp fiction genre to be reprinted in 2003 by Feminist Press. I might add that you can get most of the books I'm showing you today by going online and searching. And in fact, that's where I got the covers, because most of our covers, as you'll see shortly, have either been lost or the cover's damaged, so I had to go searching for some better covers. So the internet can be helpful sometimes. Okay, now, Valerie Taylor was actually a pseudonym for Velma Tate. That's her married name. American writer. She later divorced her husband, supposedly using the funds from her lesbian pulp fiction to fund the divorce. So she was an American writer. She didn't just write pulp fiction. She wrote romances and poetry under a variety of names, and she produced a particularly large number of pulp fiction novels during that mid-20th century golden age. She was also a gay activist in America. So there are a few of them. Very lurid covers, but all pulp fiction had lurid covers. So there are 6 of them. She was actually Velma Nacella Tate Young. I think she reverted to Young, I'm not sure, after her divorce. There's a collection of 9 early lesbian pulp fiction novels from the 50s and 60s. And remember, these books, however... I'm trying to find a word that isn't a put down. It was an outlet for women, as I mentioned earlier, because it provided representation for a community of women who were completely isolated, or mostly isolated, by a very conservative culture across the world. And if they had desires for other women, generally they were unable to act on those desires unless they were upper class or had in England or had money and could basically live the way they wanted to. So coming now to a very influential but much more serious work. This is, again, lesbian. It's an extremely influential book. It was banned from 1928 to 1949 after a court case in Great Britain. The writer, Radcliffe Hall, was born in 1886, and she was actually called John throughout most of her life because she was nicknamed John by an early lover. She had a series of very long-term same-sex relationships over her lifetime. She was, again, initially a poet. She had, I think, 5 or 6 published volumes, and then she turned to novel writing. Her first published novel was The Forge, which appeared in 1924, and then The Unlit Lamp. This one, The Well of Loneliness, appeared in 1928. Part of the controversy was because of its unambiguous revelations about lesbian relationships. Now, I'm not talking about detailed graphic sex here. I'm talking about the depth of feeling. If anything, it reads now a little bit over the top, or it does to me, but it was probably the first modern work to really seriously explore the strength of feeling between same-sex attracted women, or, that's a term that I hadn't heard before I started researching this, inverts. Radcliffe Hall herself called herself an invert. In other words, inverted from the normal way of being something different. And of course, the word queer came in later. So Well of Loneliness was very powerful in its depiction of deep love between women, and it became very widely read, especially after 1949, when the censorship ban was lifted. But by then, Radcliffe John Hall had been dead for 6 years. Now this one, same book, it's a 1951 edition, State Library's catalogued copy, and you can see it's been very well used and was at some stage, when you open it up, you can see it was at some stage a public loan copy. So there were a lot of people reading that book. And this is really intriguing. I've never seen an insert like this in any of our other published items. Jenny, did you ever come across anything like that? It reads, "This book has been purchased not because of any supposed literary quality, but as a specimen of the work of an author who in his, crossed out, her day, was immensely popular and who has therefore a place in the history of popular taste. It is a museum piece." And I asked a number of people, long-term staff members, nobody had seen anything like it before. So it was a loan copy. It was put in, I suspect, to protect us from, I don't know, accusations that might lead to censorship. I don't know why it was there, but it is very, very unusual to see that in a loan book, certainly in our collections. This is a typescript manuscript of The Well. It's an item held by the Kenneth Spencer Research Library in Kansas, in America. It shows lines cut out or cut by the author, and next to it is pasted a photograph of Radcliffe Hall taken around about the book's publication in 28, and it will look better if I put it right way up. Okay. So The Well of Loneliness ends with the main character, known as Stephen, deliberately driving away the woman she loves, her name, yes, Stephen, so that her beloved can have a better life with someone else, in this case a male. So Stephen is left alone in a large cold house apart from a small dog. The novel ends with her desperate plea to God, "Give us also the right to our existence." I'm now going to show you several books from our collection which I found useful, at least as a starting point, in researching Australian gay and lesbian history and literary sources. This is Gay Perspectives, Essays in Australian Gay Culture. Mainly focuses on the eastern states and Tasmania, but I did find a couple of interesting references to SA, and it's great because it has extensive footnotes, so that was really helpful. And that led me to this. This is from our pamphlet collection. I would never have picked it up or seen it if it hadn't been for this note on it in Gay Perspectives, Essays in Gay Culture. It contains research by McClellan into South Australia's early colonial inns and taverns. So what's that got to do with homosexuality? That wasn't a word at that stage, by the way. It wasn't a term that was used till much later. Anyway, in April 1839, a correspondent to the Essay Colonist, which is published in London about the new colony of South Australia. So the correspondent in 1839 was reporting on accommodation for single men. And in his report, he talked about the town's 3 earliest inns, and one in particular, the Adelaide, allowing mollies, that is men dressed as women, into its hostelry. And he writes that by 9 p.m, he talks about how there were rows and rows of cots that were put out in the Adelaide inn. And he writes that by 9 p.m, every bed had been taken. He describes the occupants, and the implication is in the last 4 lines when he records that, and I quote, "The youth, beauty and retirement of a third, aided by candlelight, creates simperings amongst the others and even surmises regarding the sex." Now, I would have read that and just gone, what? But if you're reading it with an eye to researching gay literature, the reference becomes quite clear, because women did not go into those hostelries. They stayed on the ships when they first arrived, or were with their families or their husbands or whatever families in tents somewhere else, or some other form of accommodation in 1839. So yes, there is an implication there, not proven, but an implication, and that's very early. On the left, this 1970s book from our collections is by Robert French. He was a gay activist and archivist, and it covers colonial settlement to the beginnings of gay liberation in Australia, and talks about gay and lesbians from Australian history. It's a very informative read, lots of little short vignettes, and again, it gave me some useful leads and references. And that very large publication on the right, Gay and Lesbian Literary Heritage, published some 20 years ago or more, and it contains a short 2 to 3 page section on Australian and New Zealand writers that would run to a much, that's gay writers, would run to a much larger inclusion now. So despite the size of this mammoth publication, there wasn't a lot published prior to the 1950s. Homosexual writers, especially male, were very reluctant to come out in public because of the personal cost. So here are two books by American authors. Charles Jackson, writer of The Fall of Valour, had already had great success with The Lost Weekend, which I think was made into a film with Ray Milland, but I'm not sure. The Fall of Man was a follow-up, less successful, possibly because of the subject matter. It deals with 2 heterosexual couples, one a pair of newlyweds. The husband of the older couple begins to feel very strong attraction for the younger male, and I don't know what happens next because I don't have time to read all of these all the way through. I wish I did. Everyone thinks that librarians read books all day. I wish. Jess Stearns, the one on the right, Jess Stearns' The Sixth Man, was written by a reporter, American, who claimed to have research that proved that every 6th male in America was actually gay, probably repressing their feelings. Now, given that might well be true, but given that Stearns gave everything a sensational spin, including reincarnation, and I know that because I read his books on Edgar Cayce when I was a kid, and prostitution and everything else he could find, I really hope that his research was thoroughly checked and verified before being published. It was very influential in America, not always with good result. This is some of the more serious material that we're getting into now. A Way of Love by New Zealand writer. Now remember, these books, many of them are in the collection or in the Institute collection, so they're either catalogued, or if they're not catalogued, I have a list given to me by published collections, which you can't see, and that's why I'm talking about these now. Eventually, we hope those books will be catalogued. That's the project. Okay, so this was in our collections. It's A Way of Love by New Zealand writer James Courage, not yet catalogued. 3 other novels by James Courage have been catalogued in the State Library collection, and these are The Call Home, a novel, The Visit to Pen Morton, and The Young Have Secrets, a novel. Courage was born in 1903, died in 1963. He was at various times a novelist, a short story writer, a poet, a bookseller, and during the war served as a fire warden in England. He'd moved from New Zealand to England, where most of his books are set. A Way of Love examined a young man's homosexual relationship with an older man, and although it was quite discreetly written, it was banned under New Zealand censorship provisions, and very few New Zealanders could access it. More recently, there's been a revival, and some commentators have seen it as a major influence in gay literature. Courage was the first New Zealand writer to directly address same-sex relationships, and writing A Way of Love and similar works was a very brave act. So why brave? Well, we're going to have a look at the circumstances surrounding homosexuality in most places. Oh, there we go. So this is the cover of the UK Wolfenden Report. The Wolfenden Report was a government commissioned study containing recommendations for laws governing sexual behaviour, not homosexual behaviour specifically, sexual behaviour in the UK. It was published in 1957 in Britain by the Committee on Homosexual Offences and Prostitution in Great Britain. It was named for Sir John Wolfenden, the chairman of the committee. So using the findings of psychoanalysis and social science, the report urged that public statutes avoid the attempt to legislate morality and that they concern themselves only with sexual acts that offend public decency or disrupt order. So this came out in 1957. Part of it was a recommendation that private homosexual liaisons between consenting adults be removed from the domain of criminal law. It took 10 years before the law was actually changed. It was huge controversy and a lot of resistance. So legislation implementing the recommendations of the Wolfenden report was finally enacted in the Sexual Offences Act of 1967. This is Robert Hutton's Of Those Alone. It's fairly hard to find, actually. And we do have a copy, and I know that because it's on my desk at the moment. So it was written in the wake of the report of the Departmental Committee on Homosexual Offences and Prostitution, the Wolfenden report. And Hutton also, as well as writing very frankly about his life and his homosexuality, he got into asking two related questions. It's quite societal questions. And they were, is homosexuality congenital or acquired, that is, nature or nurture, or both, or none perhaps. He also looks at the belief, prevalent in the early mid to 20th century, that alcoholism and homosexuality were intrinsically linked. And by the way, it was sexologists who invented and implemented the term homosexual during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The term queer was certainly in use by the 1950s, but I'm unsure of when it first came to be used as a descriptive noun, and perhaps one of you could enlighten me a bit later. So this scene near the River Torrens shows a solitary walker watching a small rowing boat floating by. Given the circumstances and hostility from the law and the public at large, it's not surprising that gay meetings were hurried and clandestine. Until much later in the century, and this is what most of us forget, most young males, and most young women as well, of course, lived at home with their parents. So there were very few meeting places, hence gay beats, and the banks of the Torrens was one. This, still standing, is the former water police station on the south side of the River Torrens. It still stands near the parade ground on Victoria Drive. It was erected in 1928, and the police who staffed it had oversight of incidents on the Torrens Lake and River, and also searched out gays and heterosexual couples misbehaving on the banks of the river. Here's a 1939 view of the river near the university footbridge. And it was in this area, 33 years after that photograph was taken, that a recently arrived university law lecturer was thrown into the river by a person or persons unnamed, not unknown, unnamed, in a night of gay bashing. Dr. George Duncan couldn't swim and he drowned. There were other victims that night, there were witnesses to what happened, but no one was convicted. Several Vice Squad police left the force shortly afterwards. Duncan's death led Premier John Dunstan, himself openly bisexual, but later, to instigate both further investigation and subsequent law reform. So in 1975, South Australia became the first state in Australia to decriminalise homosexual relations between consenting adults. And I just want to show you this 2015 quote from Ban Ki-moon, who was a South Korean diplomat and Secretary General of the United Nations from 2007 to 2016, and it says it all really. That's the Duncan Memorial, and that's the quote. Okay, so this is an early postcard view of North Terrace, taken probably about 1910. So it was very difficult to safely meet same-sex orientated people. There were, of course, discreet clubs, home gatherings, cafes, even the occasional adverts. I did see one actually from the very late 20th century for a Uranian wishing to meet other Uranians. Uranian was an early term that covered same-sex, but it was a bit more complicated than that because it was to do with classical beauty, and I won't go into it, but anyway, it was interesting, and unfortunately I lost the reference and haven't found it yet. I'll find it again. So hotel bars as meeting places became extremely popular, especially from the 1940s on. I didn't know that. And there were coffee shops as well, a couple. The war years probably influenced the meeting in bars because of the huge influx of troops from other countries, particularly America, and also interstate, where there were probably, because the populations were larger, it was perhaps easier to meet people and to mix and mingle. Adelaide, as you know, is not 6 steps removed, but about 2 steps removed. If you know someone, they know someone who knows you or your family or your background. And I can see a few smiles out there. It's absolutely correct. And it would have been even more so when Adelaide's population was smaller. So people had to be careful because homosexuality was punishable with hard labour. Okay. In fact, at one stage, it was a capital crime and people were hanged for being homosexual. The British ended that early in, I think it was 1839. They ended the legislation for hanging. But Australia being Australia, we continued it in the eastern states and Tasmania for about another 6 or 7 years, I think. So it was a very, very difficult time if you were same-sex orientated. Still is for some. Okay, so I'm going to show you now a few known pick-up places of the period. We're talking 1940s onwards to about the 1960s. And my information comes from an impeccable source, whom I'll reveal at the end of the program. This is the Gresham, I think. Yes, on North Terrace. Here it is again. And its near neighbour, but for one small building, was the beautiful South Australian Hotel. It was the poshest hotel in Adelaide at its time, and despite massive public protest, it was destroyed by developers well before its time. There are a few of the waiters that are private. They're getting ready their cocktail bar for a private function in the South Australian Hotel. And here, I loved this one. This was 2 cars, quite posh, particularly the one in the foreground, the convertible, and they're parked on a side street around the corner from the South Australian Hotel, and one window of the hotel can be seen in the left foreground. Told you it was posh. And here we are, the northeast corner of Hindley Street in Gresham. I think I've got that one right. Yes, it was... When it was established, this hotel in the about 1839, it was called the Australian Arms Inn, and then it went through a whole lot of name changes until 1854, and then it became the Royal Exchange, and then it became the Exchange again, and the name kept swapping between Royal Exchange and Exchange, and the whole place was pulled down in February 1960. And this one was taken in September 1962, obviously, and it's the Red Lion. The left side of the Red Lion Hotel is about 33 yards west of James Place. It was built in 1845, demolished in 1966. And going back in the other direction, east, I'm going to tell you just a little bit of a story. Okay, now this is from the Australian Lesbian and Gay Archives, published as part of its History Bites series by Graham Willett and others, one of the others, again being the person I'm going to mention a little later, referenced by my impeccable source. And we're getting closer as we approach the last sections of today's program. So far as I can tell, from Sands and McDougall directories, the lampshade shop was around here. I'll talk the story through as we go. Okay. So I think that the very dilapidated building in the second photo, the one with the sort of torn blind, I'm pretty sure that that's 231A Rundle Street. I was trying to work it out. It's a few doors up from Miss Gladys Simchoon, which still stands. So both stories were operated by a man called Albert Hine, also known as Big Bertha. Now, Big Bertha, and by the way, if I actually looked up the Sands and McDougalls and the electoral rolls, because there was a bit of confusion about who actually owned the lampshade shop. There was another person's name that appeared, Robert, and then Paul Carlyle. Very confusing. But anyway, Albert Hine does appear in the electoral rolls at that address, and he gives his occupation as shearer, which I thought was rather interesting for somebody who sells lampshades to high society. The lampshade shop was frequented by very, very high society ladies, including the governor's wife, and she bought several lampshades from me. It was sort of fancy stuff. It wasn't your average Coles or Woolworths lamp. It was, moulded lamps and apparently very lovely stuff, and there are at least a couple of them, or were, in the governor's residence. She probably packed them up and took them back to England with her, I don't know. But anyway, so there were lots of parties held by Mr. Hine, also known as Big Bertha, and people could dress as they wished. They could socialise with like-minded people. They had a gay old time, literally, and it was a safe place to meet and to be themselves. Until one night, it wasn't. Somebody dobbed them in, possibly a parent of one of the young people who turned up there. When I say young, I'm not talking children. I'm talking about 17, 18, 20, that sort of age group. So early 1950, they were dobbed in and there was a police raid. There was no sexual activity going on, but the police took away the very, very frightened young men that they caught. They intimidated them and they got them to plead guilty to all sorts of acts of unnatural vice. So charges were laid. There was a court case and inevitable consequences. Bert Hine, I'm told, left town in a hurry, possibly with his mother in tow, although no charges were laid against him. He was present, but the police found nothing, but it was taking people away and browbeating them that got all of these confessions. Anyway, there were horrific consequences for the men involved. The newspapers outed them. Most were jailed. Anyone who wasn't jailed was ruined. Jobs were gone, incomes, families, futures, all gone. Families disowned people. And what's so ironic is that it did no good whatsoever. This appeared later in the same year, in October. It showed absolutely no decrease in arrests for sex offences or gross indecency, which was the coverall term. And supervisors of youth organisations were advised to watch for any signs of perversion in their young charges. So anyone who ran a youth group of any kind was advised, and I quote, I won't quote that bit just yet. They were advised that if they saw any signs of deviance, perversion, any kind of same-sex attraction, they were to this is the quote, continually suppress it as they would kill a dangerous beast, end quote. So a lot of moral outrage, a lot of fear, and what a waste of government resources. Now, let me be clear, I'm not talking about children. This was, and still is, about young men and women trying to work out where they belong, what they want, and who they want to be. And the unrelenting social pressure did them absolutely no good, and I suspect an awful lot of harm. The fear of being blackmailed, ostracised, intimidated, bashed, or even killed must have pushed innumerable gay, lesbian and transgender people further into fear and despair, into self-loathing, into rebellion, mental illness, and in some cases suicide. So now I want to introduce you to another Bert. Many of you will have heard of him, Bert Edwards. Now, I'm just going to give you a summary. If you want to know more about the man that most Adelaideans called the King of the West End, please read this informative and entertaining account of his life and times by Pat Summerling. Excuse me. So this is St Francis Xavier Cathedral, Catholic Cathedral and Hall, with a young boy in the foreground. It's approximately 1905. Albert Augustine Edwards was born in the West End of Adelaide. We don't know who his father was, although his body was exhumed at one stage because he was trying to prove a connection to a politician. Didn't happen. But anyway, he was essentially had a single mother. So who knows? Maybe this was Albert Augustine Edwards as a small boy staring up at the grand church hall and pondering his future. It was certainly a very notable future. Bert Edwards was a South Australian state politician for 14 years. He was an Adelaide City Councillor for 32 years, and he was the owner of a series of pubs for 30 years. In 1931, after a notorious court case, he was sentenced to 5 years with hard labour, committing an unnatural offence with a 17-year-old male. He served approximately 2.5 years of that. So these are Bert Edwards' tea rooms on the east side of Compton Street. I believe the building is still standing. It was close to Goodger Street, Compton Street, and Bert Edwards is there on the left, standing with one of his employees, and there are round trees, pastels, I'm reliably told, and other sweets displayed in the window. Bert conducted a 2-up school at the back of the premises. That was very typical of Bert Edwards. This is a 1921 photograph of football players. We think they're the Brunswicks, the Brunnies. That is the Brunswick Football Club. Bert had become a state politician in 1918 and had gone from the tea rooms to owning his first hotel, the Brunswick, in the city. The team's names aren't known, but there's Bert Edwards in the centre of the photograph in his dapper suit and hat. I think that's called a Homburg, and I believe he wore it most of the time. Okay. And there's another one. There he is with members of the West Adelaide Footy Club football team, and he was on the West Adelaide team committee. Not a great photograph, but from 1914 to 31, he held grey ward in the Adelaide City Council for the Labor Party, and as well was a member for Adelaide in the House of Assembly from 1917 to 31. There he is in the front row, 4th from the left, and it's a group photograph of a parliamentary visit to the Eyre Peninsula in 1926. He would have been in his probably late 30s at this stage. It's another of his pubs, the Newmark Hotel. It's at the corner of North and West, West Terraces. So he sold his pub, and the first pub, runs at Brunswick, and he leased the Newmarket in 1924. There was another pub that he had at Second Valley, and at various times he also held licences for the Castle Inn, which his brother looked after while Bert was in jail, and later he went to the Black Lion Hotel at Hindmarsh. So there may have been others. So Bert expanded his pub ownership outside of Adelaide, although he almost always lived in or near the city. So this is the Hotel Victor at Victor Harbour, and he opened that in 1927. This photograph was 1928. So in February 1931, Bert Edwards was convicted of having committed an unnatural offence. That's another catch-all term like gross indecency, but it basically meant sex with another male. He protested his innocence, but the jury disagreed by a 10-2 majority. There was talk of a witch hunt, in part engineered by Bert's political opponents, and there was probable personal grievance on the part of witnesses, there was collusion, and there was talk of blackmail. But nevertheless, Bert was convicted and he was sentenced to 5 years with hard labour. He was also later expelled from the Labor Party. And this is a news report on his conviction. The case received very wide publicity. Ironically, Bert had been the state government spokesman on prisons and reformatories from 1924 and a visiting justice at the Yatala Labor Prison. He was a very public figure. So he served on a wide variety of committees, including the board of the Public Library, that's us, Public Library, Museum and Gallery, Art Gallery as it was then. And in fact, Bert was a very effective prison reformer, but he resigned in 1927 after the Conservatives launched a royal commission into the release of prisoners. According to the Australian Dictionary of Biography, he told the 1926 Law Reform Commission that the McGill Reformatory was filthy, vermin-infested and did not rehabilitate, and state wards were being used as cheap labour force. The result of those efforts led to better management and an act which set up the Children's Welfare and Public Relief Board. At the end of his trial, Bert railed against the Chief Justice, Sir George Murray, and attacked his impartiality or lack thereof. That was in court. Now, as a politician, Bert had always supported the poor and disadvantaged, particularly the city dwellers. His reputation in the West End of Adelaide as a benefactor and supporter of the disadvantaged was so high that on his release, he was promptly re-elected to Adelaide City Council, and he remained a councillor until his death in 1963. They did love him. He got that title of the King of the West End probably when he was only in about his late 20s, early 30s, but he was always known for working for his people and looking after them. Okay, so here he is, pictured in 1956, about 5 years before he died. Bert Edwards, Adelaide City Councillor, former member of the House of Assembly, shown with his car in Flinders Street, Adelaide. I think it's a 55 Studebaker Champion four-door sedan, and he loved that car, like his Homburg. Okay, so after he died on 24th of August 1963, his body was embalmed, placed in a copper casket. A requiem mass was held at St Francis Xavier's Cathedral, and there was a huge funeral. Many, many people attended, very large funeral, and Bert was buried at West Terrace. A philanthropist to the end, his estate of almost £46,000, big money in those days, was left to be divided amongst Adelaide's poor. Now, almost to the end. Besides Pat Summerling's book, Bert Edwards, King of the West End, Bert was celebrated in a musical, also called King of the West End. It focuses on Bert's trial and was written by Adelaide gay activist and playwright Ian Purcell, AM. And here's Ian in September 2015 speaking at the launch of an Open and Shut case, an exhibition at the State Library of South Australia. And the photographer, Jenny Scott, much missed staff member Jenny. Yeah. Okay. So here's another of Ian Purcell's musicals, plays, another musical called The Pink Files. It was developed from a group of oral history interviews about gay history in Adelaide, mostly from the 1940s on, although one interview, I think, has somebody talking way back in 1910, 1915 about how he met someone in a cafe and started a relationship. All in all, about 20 interviews were recorded on cassette by a man called John Lee, who lived in both Adelaide and then later Sydney. And John Lee's work informed and inspired Ian Purcell's work, particularly for the Pink Files. And this flyer and program is from the 2001 production by Junction Theatre Company, now defunct. I believe that the original cassettes are still held in the Australian Queer Archives. Jenny, would you know? Would you know where the original cassettes are?
I believe it was Queer Archives. But
they are Queer Archives.
They're not in South Australia.
Yep. So yes, Jenny's just substantiated that she thinks also they're held in the Australian Queer Archives interstate, and I am hoping that the interviews have now been transferred to a safer medium, because cassette tapes particularly degrade very easily and lose their content. So the value of archival collections is immense, especially given how much they do just to keep, not just to keep histories and stories, but also to inform creatives, actors, writers, musicians, poets who bring these stories to life. The John Lee interviews inspired Ian Purcell, and through Ian, someone else, well known and celebrated in Adelaide for her witty and wonderful walking tours, and now not one, but two books inspired by those walks. I am speaking, of course, of the iconic doyen of Adelaide gay history, Dr. Gertrude Glossop, PhD, that is formal drapery, Curtin University. And Gertrude is the alter ego of one Will Sargent. So there's Will, second from left, John Levy, Anne Levy, former Minister for the Arts on the left, Will Sargent, Jenny Scott. Jenny, how did you do that photograph? And Tim Reeves, did you have it? Because you're cited as photographer for that.
I'm sorry.
You're cited in our catalogue as photographer for that image. Did you just put it on?
It's not a selfie.
No. Oh.
I think something very borrowed my camera.
That would make sense. Okay, I thought it was very, very good shot for someone to... Okay, and here's... yes, because he took quite a few photographs. Okay, and here's Gertrude, Will's alter ego. Here's Gertrude at the Pride March, and that one was taken by Jenny Scott. I hope that's correct. That's what our catalogue says, so it should be true. So I mentioned that Gertrude is now the published author of two books, and this one was the first one, and a very entertaining read it is. That one I did read. State Library holds two copies. Her second book, Gert by Sea, covers gay history in a number of Adelaide's seaside locations, and I expect it will be an equally entertaining and informative read. So that brings us to the end today. The feast program ended last weekend on the 19th. And I just want to point out that as well as published works, the State Library holds a significant and growing part of South Australian gay and lesbian history in our archives and ephemera collections, including posters and programs. And although we were not an official part of the 2023 program, we really hope this will change next time round. So to the hard-working organisers, the volunteers and the performers of Feast, I hope you had a great festival. Long may it continue. And thank you to our Live and Learn audience for your support of State Library and this program. This is the last Live and Learn for this year, and next year we'll see some changes in our presentations, particularly with the retirement of our excellent colleague Carolyn Spooner, who I think has just gone off to... Is she here? Carolyn... That's Carolyn Spooner, who does many of these programs. She is retiring, and we wish you the very best of luck, and you're going to have a wonderful time writing books. And we do hope to see Carolyn back in a few months as a guest presenter. But meanwhile, there will be some changes. So keep an eye on the State Library website early next year for details. And we wish you all a wonderful, peace-filled Christmas and a very, very happy New Year. Thank you.